This is Japan in the year 1945, and this is Japan 40 years later. Within a span of a single generation, Japan went from a war-torn country at risk of starvation to one of the most powerful economies on the planet. But as soon as it got close to the end of the 20th century, something terrible happened. On September 22, 1985, 5 of the wealthiest nations from around the world joined hands aiming to save the global economy. They were successful in their mission, but when it came to the land of the rising sun, their sun was now beginning to set. From that day onwards, more and more blunders were made over the remainder of the decade. It finally gave way to massive financial crisis, making way for stagnant growth, a huge unemployment rate, and collapsing asset prices. It is a period that we now call the lost decade. On the surface, Japan still presents an image of a highly advanced tech-based country. It is home to world-recognized brands like Toyota, Nexus, Sony, Nissan, and many more. Yet under the surface, one would find nothing but a dying economy with an aging population in decline every year since 1990. So, what went wrong? This is the story of Japan's lost decade. Post-war Japan. By the end of World War II, not only did Japan lose 2.5 million of its people to the conflict, their industrialized economy had now been completely destroyed. From 1942 to 1946, over a span of only 4 years, Japanese GNP was reduced by half. They lost 93% of their steel production, and food shortages forced them to reduce caloric intake to 2/3 of what it was before the war. The situation was dire. At first, the USA wasn't interested in rebuilding the war-torn Japan. However, with a communist takeover in China and half of Korea, and Russia already being socialist, the USA needed to show a capitalistic success story in Asia. Japan was their best shot. In order to make Japan into a thriving nation, the USA decided not only to revive its industrial potential, but also keep the value of the Japanese yen extremely low. To give you an idea, in the beginning a single dollar was worth as much as 360 Japanese yen. The value of the yen being this low meant that the Japanese goods would be much cheaper than anything else in American markets. This would incentivize the Americans to keep purchasing and thus keep the Japanese economy going. The USA in the early 1950s made up half of the world's economy. Therefore, they believed they could easily make the Japanese economy grow without this ever harming their own position. Over the course of the next few decades, the US's idea of making Japan an export-based country turned out to be an extremely successful one, much more than they had initially planned. From 1960 to 1975, the Japanese economy rose by more than 400% in only 2 decades. And by the 1980s, made in Japan had changed its meaning from cheaper products to high-quality products at an affordable price. The US's plan to simply keep the Japanese economy afloat now seemed to threaten the US's very own economic dominance. Here's an example. In the late 80s, 75% of US bonds were sold to Japan. 8 of the world's largest banks and 14 of the 20 richest companies were Japanese. This incredible growth of Japan over the course of only a single generation was miraculous. Thus it was termed the Japanese miracle. Now, before we move further, it is worth mentioning that another extraordinary feature of the Japanese miracle was job security and wealth equality. These aren't a norm in capitalism. However, in Japan, the salary gap between an employee and his manager is much, much less than what we see in the US or other Western capitalist countries. As for the job security, the Japanese had a unique culture where big firms would hire fresh graduates only in massive group interviews. Those employees would serve that firm until retirement, and there was not a trend of switching or firing. One drawback to this culture is that you get only one shot right after graduation, and if you don't land a job then, you won't land a good job ever. If I'm going to drop a spoiler, this is exactly what would happen in the future. New York Plaza Accord. Back to the issue at hand. Japanese-style capitalism had given rise to the Japanese miracle, but on the other side of the planet, the US dollar appreciated by around 26% in 4 years, from 1980 to 1984. With the international trade being done in US dollars, this appreciation was not just affecting America, but could have been disastrous to the global economy. The next fiscal year, the dollar appreciated by a further 17%, and these stark increases were beginning to threaten to disrupt the world's financial markets. Something had to be done, so the representatives from the G5 nations came together trying to find a solution. On September 22, 1985, representatives of the USA, Japan, the UK, France, and West Germany signed the New York Plaza Accord, named after the New York Plaza Hotel. According to this accord, Japanese yen and West Germany's mark were to be appreciated significantly to lessen the effect of the appreciating US dollars. This appreciation meant that Japanese exports would now be more expensive in international markets. This in turn meant American products could now be more competitive. You might wonder why Japan would accept such an offer. Being an export-oriented nation, it was clearly a losing deal. However, external pressure plays a major role here. Japan, at any cost, could not risk their relations with the USA or other major economies. After all, they are the ones that buy the Japanese products. Furthermore, the Japanese government also came out of the agreement thinking that this would have a little effect on their exports and would make imports much easier. The accord had met most of its goals by 1987, but the yen just did not stop. It kept appreciating to the level where it would begin to harm the Japanese export industry. Economic bubble burst. As the Japanese yen had been surging since 1986, the Bank of Japan, trying to get a hold of the situation, started handing out loans. They hoped people would invest in the industries for exportable goods. To facilitate investors, the interest rate was reduced from 5% to 2.5%. However, people started investing in real estate instead, and thus land prices skyrocketed. On average, land prices went up by 245% between 1985 and 1989. At its peak, the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, spreading over 1.31 square miles, was worth more than the entire state of California, which at that time wasn't known for any cheap real estate. Japanese banks were giving loans to everyone who asked for them, without inquiring what they needed it for and whether they would be able to return it. And when banks started to run out of their reserves, they would just print more money and keep giving loans. You cannot just print money to make money, right? Well, the Japanese thought they could, and thus entered an economic bubble that was bound to pop at any time. The authorities only realized the gravity of the matter in 1989. Interest rates were then hurriedly increased to 4.23% in 89 and then to 6% in 1990. However, they had already passed the point of no return. It all came to a head in 1990. The bubble burst and the Japanese stock market crashed. Over the course of a few days, the Japanese yen fell to its lowest value since the 1950s. Since that day, the Japanese economy hasn't recovered completely, and the nation is surviving off of the loans from major banks. The lost decade. Usually, a stagnant economy does not hurt regular citizens, especially when the nation has grown enough to provide good living standards. But with Japan, it went differently. Small businesses were forced to shut down, while the corporates were forced to cut down on their employees. But rather than firing anyone, they chose to halt their hiring processes. The failing economy made many corporations quit their hiring in 1991 and only restart it in the next century. Now, remember what we discussed about the unique hiring culture of Japan? You get one shot right after graduation and no second chances. When the rehiring started in the 21st century, companies wanted fresh graduates only. And those that graduated in the last decade of the 20th century weren't fresh graduates anymore. They never had job opportunities and never will, and thus, to this day, are relying on part-time, low-paying jobs. That decade is termed the lost decade in the Japanese context because of its adverse fate. In between 1990 and 2003, a total of 212,000 businesses went bankrupt, and over 5 million people lost their jobs. The generation that witnessed the Japanese miracle was seeing their children grow up in an entirely different environment. Not having a stable job means not having any stable income. Usually, a huge population and a lack of stable income in a capitalist country is correlated to a hike in crime rates. However, in Japan, people instead turned to suicide. During the lost decade, suicides became a major cause of death among Japanese males aging 20 to 44. Japan saw an increase of more than 150% in suicides from 1980 to 2000. Even when corporations started rehiring in the 21st century, there just weren't as many opportunities as before. As of today, Toyota is the only Japanese country in the list of the top 50 richest companies. 21st century Japan. A lot of people see today's Japan as a well-off nation. And while yes, it is true that by living standards, Japan is still well ahead of the world's average, however, if an economist is to look at Japan, the island nation seems frozen in time, with no progress made in the last 2 decades. Can this nation regrow like it did after the Second World War? We hope so, but for that they need a workforce. Japan is not the most welcoming when it comes to skilled immigration from third world nations, and with a decade of unemployment, individuals stopped planning to have a family, and thus Japan has extremely low birth rates. Japan is relying solely on the young population that it has and making them work twice as hard. This has worsened the situation even further, as more and more people are leaving their jobs and becoming hikikomori, the Japanese term that translates to social inwardness. These people cut themselves off from society and never leave their rooms, depending completely on their parents. Even after the lost decade, Japan never recovered fully. Its economy isn't growing, and it is even now losing out on innovation. It is true that Japan is still the 3rd biggest economy in the world. However, that economy comes with a debt-to-GDP ratio of more than 261% as of 2022, which is the highest in the world. All in all, the situation doesn't look too bright for the country's future. But what do you think? Will the Japanese economy experience another miracle, or is its slow decline cast in stone? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe as we tell more of today's economic stories.